Thank you so much. And most of all, thank you all for being here. We know that the temptations of Berlin are looming large. So with that, I want to take a somewhat bigger perspective for a moment and talk about flexibility broadly, while then also focusing in on time flexibility and locational flexibility. And what I'm going to do in the next 10 minutes is, in fact, give you a bit of a summary of the chapter of the book that was mentioned before, Make Work Fair, where we talk about work arrangements specifically. Now, before I go there, just a quick precursor here. As soon as I can change my slides. Yeah, perfect. In that fairness is an interesting word, and we chose it very purposely. And some press, of course, thinks that we chose the word specifically for this moment in time. As you can tell, I'm Swiss originally, but I come from the US. That's not why we wrote the book. We wrote the book because we thought that, in fact, the DEI would benefit from a rethink. And that's what the book is trying to do. Now, let me talk a bit more about specifically 3 aspects of flexible work. The first one is parental leave. And the person on the screen here is Josh Leffs, and some of you might have read his book, All In. He became noteworthy because he sued CNN, his employer at the time, because he wasn't given paternity leave. Eventually, CNN found a compromise with Josh, and he was actually given parental leave. But I'm starting with his example because one of the issues that we have is that in this broad space of flexibility, we have gender differences in uptake. You have gender differences in uptake of parental leave. You have gender differences in interest in flexible work. You have gender differences in interest in working remotely. And whenever we have these type of gender differences, I'm an economist by training, the market will respond and will discriminate against the people they find less attractive. So one first important takeaway is parental leave has to be available to everyone, independent of your gender or your sex. Now, Santander, the multinational bank headquartered in Spain, also shared that view. A few years ago, they introduced parental leave, but men were not taking it. So they ran a little experiment. So they first asked the men, would you take parental leave if ever you became a father? What do you think about parental leave? And more than 90% of the male employees at Santander said, yes, of course. Great thing, and I will take it. And then they were asked, what do you think about other men in our company? And they're like, oh, no. Other men, no, they will not take parental leave. They don't think that's a great thing. That's a women's thing. And then the simple intervention, the simple experiment then is to tell everyone that, in fact, almost every man thinks parental leave is a good thing. So the norm, in fact, is not what you think, that nobody believes in it, but the norm is that most people actually do believe in it, most men in this instance, and it turns out that led to more men taking parental leave. So it's important for us to think about this question of uptake because you have a resume here in front of you, and if you compare Robert's first job as project assistant with his second job as junior project manager, you will see that there is something that I'm going to call a career gap in quotation marks. 4 years, right? So he had a bit of a gap between his first job and his second job. Colleagues of mine ran a large experiment in the United Kingdom with 9,000 employers trying to understand how big is the penalty of having career gaps. How much less likely are you to be invited to an interview if on your resume you show a career gap of half a year, 3 years of more? It turns out that gap is huge, even though in research, we actually don't know how much less productive you will be if you have taken a career gap. Maybe you'll be more productive because you have learned new things. Maybe you will return refreshed. Probably if I had been out of the workforce for 20 years, that probably would have affected my, my understanding of economics. But maybe 1 year, 2 years, very, very hard to know. So, my summary here is really important for us to think about leave, who takes leave, and make leave available to everyone and make sure everyone takes it up. Okay, Second point I want to make is about time flexibility. And I want to dispel a bit of a myth. And the myth is that blue-collar workers never benefit from time flexibility. It is absolutely true that white-collar workers tend to benefit more from flexible work arrangements. However, there are very interesting examples of establishments that have introduced time flexibility to the great benefits of their workers. And I have an example here. Chick-fil-A is a fast food chain in the United States. And they have now introduced time flexibility where workers can choose how many hours per day they want to work. Let's assume they have a 35-hour week. Maybe they want to work all of those 35 hours in 4 days, or maybe even in 3 days. Some workers chose that. It turns out it increases their happiness enormously, increases their likelihood of staying in the firm dramatically, and in fact is something that we should think much harder about. Because time inflexibility for what I'm going to call shift workers, who have very little control over their time, is a huge topic that we need to do more about to equalize the playing field. So let's move beyond white-collar work and also think about other types of work where often the employees can benefit even more from control over their lives and over the work hours. Okay. Third comment now that I'm going to talk a little more about is location flexibility, and that's probably what you're thinking about when you think about hybrid work, about remote work, etc. So first of all, on your left, you have Trip.com, and I know some of you are from Asia, so you'll be very familiar with this company. It is the biggest travel company in China, and colleagues started to run experiments with Trip already in 2006. Kind of trying to explore different versions of remote work, kind of finding what Jutta kind of just alluded to, and actually even before we talked about, not everyone feels the same about remote work. Some people love it, some people hate it. There are gender differences, there are differences between managers and employees, there are differences between junior and senior people, so one size likely doesn't fit all. But in fact, flexibility has been tried out by a number of organizations, including you have the US government here, the United States Patent and Trade Office, and then, of course, a number of tech companies like Dropbox that all of us are using a lot that are fully remote. Now, what do we know about this? First of all, it's quite interesting how many countries now are open to digital nomads. I think that's something not many people know about. 40 countries, including Germany, have specific visas for people who want to work as a digital nomad, live in Germany, pay their taxes in Germany, but work for a company that is someplace else in the world. Now, that's an interesting trend kind of globally, but I find it even more interesting when we look at one country. And I'm going to go back to the US for a moment. 90% of the growth in tech jobs in the United States happened in just a couple of cities, including the one that Jutta just mentioned, San Francisco. San Francisco, of course, Boston is a hub, San Jose, Seattle. I mean, none of this will be a surprise to you. But that, of course, creates enormous inequity in the country. Now, we have Tulsa here because Tulsa has become a really interesting example of a city that is trying to attract remote workers, that is trying to attract people who used to work in Seattle or used to work in San Francisco or in Boston, kind of moving to Tulsa and trying to do this in a smart, inclusive way where the Tulsans benefit from the digital nomads in some case, but in some case actually real residents who move to Tulsa. Some people, and I know it's controversial as Jutta just explained, but some people argue that could be the biggest equalizer in terms of geographic inequality. That all of a sudden you don't have to work, you don't have to live in the high rent, kind of community that is San Francisco or Boston, but you could actually work in Tulsa. But again, a lot has to happen that we don't have time to talk about now, but a lot has to happen in Tulsa to make this work for the Tulsans so that we don't have the issues of gentrification and other issues that can happen. Okay, Clearly, I just wanted to put this out there, clearly the world would benefit dramatically if we were able to include more people into the workforce, and I know you all know this, including the Tulsans, including the women, including people of color who too long have been discriminated against in the United States and other parts of the world. And this is just one statistic that I like that shows that GDP per capita in the United States today is about 40% larger because the restrictions of the 60s are no longer in place. Which is why I'm kind of a big fan, as you can already tell, of increased flexibility. Now, different countries have made different choices in terms of working from home. You can try to find your country. The average is about 1.2 days across the world. So these are the days that people work remotely. There's huge differences. South Korea, very low. Germany, kind of pretty average. United States, a little higher. Generally, the Anglo-Saxon countries are slightly higher. Who has benefited? Now, often in the census data, we don't have all the information we'd like to have, but I wanted to bring this slide to us here to remind us that the group that has benefited most are people with disabilities. They're often forgotten, and now then I tell you, of course, we're all like, yeah, obviously, that makes a lot of sense. So let's not forget people with disabilities. It's actually not, the differences by gender weren't huge. They were actually non-existent, as you could say. As you could see here, age, etc., didn't make such a big difference. Now, I want to end by going to India, by giving you a very concrete example of why working from home can actually make a huge difference. So what you have here on this slide are women's work participation rates by states in India. So on your left, you have Bihar, where the likelihood, where women's participation in the workforce, in the paid workforce, right? This, of course, doesn't take into account informal work, is 9%, so very low. And then on your right, you have the Himalayas, the northern states, where workforce participation of women is almost at the level of Germany, for example. So this particular study took place in Western Bengal, that's marked there in yellow, where the work participation rate was 23%. And what the researchers did was something quite simple. They just looked at how many men and women end up working in a job dependent on whether it can be done at home as compared to in the office. And why is this so important? Because I know those of you in India, of course, will know this, depending on the states where you live, the norms against women's work outside of the home are very strong. So this can actually make a big difference. So now what you have here is in yellow that 56% workforce participation rates of women who can work from home as compared to the 27% when women have to work at home. And I'm bringing this to you to suggest that sometimes, we have to think very hard about the constraints that keep people back in the geographies and the cultures that they live, and adjust our work arrangements accordingly. Okay, to summarize, so demand for flexible work is high. My number is very similar to the previous speakers. About a third of respondents say that they like it, including some recent research by economists looking at whether people actually have a willingness to pay for flexible work, right? That's what we like to see in economics, kind of saying, well, would people be willing to give up salary if they could work flexibly? How important is that really for them? And that willingness to pay is about 7%. So supply of flexible work is still continuing, even though there's a lot of noise about big companies, having everyone return to the office. We still have about 1.5 days per week working from anywhere, really. The benefits, my previous speakers have summarized them already: job satisfaction, return to turnover, but they're not the same for everyone. And the one aspect that hasn't been pointed out that I wanted to point out to you all is actually quite interesting. In our book, we discuss a study at length that has found that it is senior women who benefit most from working from home, and it is junior women who are hurt most from working from home. How does that work? So I think on junior women, we understand. It's like the lack of networks, you can't socialize, you're not there, you have the proximity problem that we heard about before. But how about senior women? Senior women are the ones to provide the mentoring, to do all those, what I'm going to call non-promotable activities that don't help their career advancement, but they are public goods, good things for the organization. So clearly, these differences across backgrounds matter. We've heard about some of the costs, including promotion gaps, etc., things that I'm sure we'll discuss in just a moment. And on that note, thank you so much.